Hello and good evening. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kuttan.
Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Last Friday, the government announced its intention to abolish mandatory death sentencing, returning discretionary power to judges in sentencing for capital crimes. Now, the relevant legislative amendments are expected to be tabled in October's parliamentary sitting and to come into effect by next January. But will these amendments receive the wholehearted support of Parliament? And is this, as some suggest, a step towards the abolition of the death penalty completely? Joining us on the show now is lawyer New Sin-Yu. There seems to be a bit of confusion, well, a lot of confusion, if you ask me. After the news first came out, I think a lot of people had confused the abolition of mandatory death sentencing with completely doing away with the death penalty. Maybe you can begin our conversation tonight by helping us understand the context of how mandatory death sentencing had been used.
Hi, thanks for having me. Yes, I agree that there has been a lot of confusion since the announcement. I think, was it 2 or 3 days ago? And the abolition of death penalty is something that has been going on for many years. But what the government had announced was not the abolishment of death penalty, it's the abolishment of mandatory death penalty. The difference is that in a mandatory death penalty situation, where it's present in 11 offences, mostly in the Penal Code as well as in the Firearms Act, that the courts do not have any discretion whatsoever in sentencing, and the courts have no choice but to sentence somebody who has been convicted under these 11 offences to the death penalty. That is, of course, quite different from the abolishment of death penalty itself, which I believe that when the government was looking at reviewing whether to abolish the mandatory death penalty, they had ruled out the question of abolishing death penalty as a whole. So this is obviously something that is positive, because the courts in many situations, their hands are tied. They cannot consider important, what we call mitigating factors, when deciding whether or not to impose the death penalty. They have no choice. And this is most often seen in cases where the offender is somebody of, one example is somebody with very low IQ. Recently, we saw the case of Nagendran, where there's a lot of public outrage, where Singapore executed a man who has the IQ of 69. And if discretion is returned to the judges through the abolishment of mandatory death penalty, courts can take into account this important mitigating factor, and they may find that in certain cases where there are important mitigating factors, for example, the person's background, the person's IQ, whether the person has been influenced by others, or the person's upbringing, all this can be considered, and the courts will be able to arrive at a fairer sentence.
Sin-Yu, is it true that it's mostly drug cases and, the possession of a certain amount of drugs or prohibited substances that have sent many people either to the gallows or to, a death row?
Yes, that's definitely the case. Even before, it was definitely the case before the amendment to the Dangerous Drug Act, the Section 39B in 2018, and it continues to be the case after the amendment. If we could recall, in 2018, there was an amendment to Section 39B of the Dangerous Drug Act, where the courts now have a discretion whether or not to impose the mandatory death penalty or life imprisonment. However, the amendment comes along with certain sets of circumstances which the court can only take into account these certain sets of circumstances. And it's very restrictive. It continues to be very restrictive because those who are impecunious, those who are of a very low IQ, they may not be able to meet this very limited set of factors where the court can say, okay, I'm not going to impose the mandatory death penalty. So we have statistics, I don't have it with me now, that by and large, the most amount of capital sentence in those who are serving mandatory death, those who are on death row, they came from a conviction of drug trafficking.
Seeing those on death row now, how might this announcement impact them? If, in fact, the amendments will happen in time and it will take effect by January next year, how might it impact those already sentenced?
Currently, there is a moratorium on execution. So those who are currently on death row, they will not be executed. But what will happen after this announcement is, like you mentioned earlier, Melissa, that the government is going to come up with legislative changes to existing laws. And they would have, there's a number of things they need to do, and it's quite a huge task ahead. They need to amend current laws containing the mandatory death penalty, to abolish it, to give discretion to the judges. And then they need to, I don't know how they're going to do it, but come out with a special legislation which would enlarge the jurisdiction of the federal court to allow the federal court or a special panel of federal court judges to review all those who are currently on death row, to review their sentence and to re-sentence them and to decide whether or not some of them should still be imposed the death penalty,
right,
and while the rest would be imposed alternative sentence, life imprisonment, perhaps.
Sinyu, you said you don't know how they're possibly going to do this. What do you think are the biggest concerns, the biggest challenges to overcome?
Well, I think it's not going to be a straightforward process, because you need to amend the Courts of Judicature Act. I think that would be a prerequisite, but it may involve an amendment to the Federal Constitution, Article 121, concerning the judiciary, because because you have to allow the federal court to re-sentence this 1,341 or 42 that had already been sentenced. So they need to revisit their decision, and for them to be able to do so, there are certain restrictions in the law, and the federal court would need a special legislation to enable them to do that. So that could be quite tricky, especially if it may involve amendments to the federal constitution. I haven't thoroughly thought it through yet. Perhaps there is a situation where you do not have to amend the federal constitution because that, you need 2/3. That could be quite complicated. Perhaps an amendment to some of the existing laws, for example, Courts of Judicature Act, that should suffice.
Right. So, how can we compare this move to the reform agenda under the Pakatan Harapan administration? We know that the MCA is taking credit for blocking or preventing this current administration from going all the way, from recognizing how cruel and irretrievable, or rather irreversible, capital punishment is. Once you've executed somebody and you found later on there was a miscarriage of justice, you can't do anything about it. You've already killed the person. So the MCA is taking very proudly accepting credit for this. How do you compare what's happening now with what was thought of under the Pakatan Harapan administration?
Well, it's a situation where, there's an announcement made and it's well received by the public, and suddenly you see everyone wanting to take credit. So, politicians will be politicians. I think the motivation lies almost entirely in public sentiment and popularity. But I do agree with you that some of the things that have been said by politicians, it's a bit, it couldn't be reconciled. So, but if you ask me if any credit should be given, it's definitely the special committee that has been set up by the Pakatan Harapan government. And of course, the credit is not solely with the special committee. There are many NGOs, statutory bodies, and activists that have been lobbying.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, Senior, I just want to ask you again. The question is the step that releases judges from, to being confined, having their hands tied in sentencing, in any way address the ethical and moral question that is the heart of the death penalty issue? Does the state have a right to kill people? Does the state have a right to impose a punishment that is both cruel and irreversible?
To only a certain extent, because the position, of course, my position is that death penalty is cruel and inhumane. So for me, the abolishment of death penalty as a whole is still the goal, and that is the growing trend under international human rights law. But of course, that's something that we as a society need to continue to look at. The abolishment of mandatory death penalty, that is something that has been accepted by most countries in the world. And to be honest, Malaysia is a bit slow in following what has been the trend in many countries. But to answer your question, it doesn't, but it helps.
Senior, you mentioned that what remains after this, what needs to happen next really is to do with public sentiment and political will. So we know that the legislative amendments have to go through Parliament now. You mentioned even possibly needing a constitutional amendment. Do you think, are you optimistic that this will get the wholehearted support of MPs, wholehearted support of the public and the voters, and therefore MPs in Parliament, that we will see this happen come January 2023?
I'm certainly optimistic. The current government, which consists of BN, PN, and Bersatu, they have signed up to it. And then you have the opposition, PH, who have also publicly stated that in their Green Book that they're going to go for abolishment of mandatory death penalty, and they have set up the committee that had looked into this. So it seems like all opposition parties are on the same page, and if they are all on the same page, then they should do what is necessary to ensure that the abolishment of mandatory death penalty takes effect, and that would include amendments to the Constitution if needed, as well as the necessary legislative amendments that comes along with it. So yeah, I'm optimistic.
All right, on that note, we want to thank you so much, Sinu, for joining us on the show. Lawyer New Sinu there, and we're going to take a quick break here on Consider This. We will be back with more on this topic. Stay tuned.
COVID-19 memperlihatkan kepada kita betapa pantasnya adaptasi teknologi di kalangan PKS kita. Niaga Awani dan Unify Business akan menyelami perjalanan kebangkitan semula PKS kita melalui segmen Jiwa SME setiap Selasa dan Khamis untuk inspirasi anda.
Transformasikan perniagaan dengan Unify Business, rakan digital pilihan anda. Hubungi kami sekarang dan jimat sehingga 50%. Jom Unify Business. Kemaskan rumah anda untuk rasa lebih selesa on demand.
So much stuff. It needs to be organised. It needs to flow.
If we want to make the kitchen feel expanded, lose this wall here.
Mengubah suai rumah anda ke tahap yang lebih baik.
I love the way it just stitches the old and new together.
We're going to make our biggest profit ever.
Dan dapatkan tips tentang tawaran pasaran terbaik.
We can show you a house that I think you'd really love.
Stream on demand bila-bila masa di Ultrabox dan aplikasi Astro Go.
Kesan global terhadap kita
terus meruncing untuk pulih semula.
Itu realitinya.
Isu mengambil kesempatan.
Terdapat beberapa pihak cuba mengambil kesempatan.
Tapi kita nak marah dengan siapa? Kalau dah ladang dia tak ada barang, kita nak kata apa?
Apakah langkah yang perlu diambil?
Mengurangkan kesan yang dialami akibat krisis perang Rusia-Ukraine.
Kita minta supaya Kementerian Pertanian mengemukakan segera cadangan jangka pendek dan juga jangka panjang.
COVID-19 memperlihatkan kepada kita betapa pantasnya adaptasi teknologi di kalangan PKS kita. Niaga AWANI dan Unify Business akan menyelami perjalanan kebangkitan semula PKS kita melalui segmen Jiwa SME setiap Selasa dan Khamis untuk inspirasi anda.
Transformasikan perniagaan dengan Unify Business, rakan digital pilihan anda. Hubungi kami sekarang dan jimat sehingga 50%. Jom Unify Business.
Hi, thanks so much for staying with Shrad and I on Consider This. We're discussing the government's plan to abolish mandatory death sentencing and return discretionary power to judges in sentencing for capital crimes. Joining us now is Dobby Chu, who's the Executive Coordinator of the Anti-Death Penalty Asia Network. Dobby, let's begin with news that the MCA has already given credit to its president, Wee Ka Siong, for the cabinet's decision not to fully abolish the death penalty. As we know, the MCA Youth Wing has an anti-death penalty abolition coalition. Can we talk a little bit about where you think the political pressure is coming from? Is it coming from ordinary people?
I think it's a mix of both. There is certainly a degree of misunderstanding or misconception of what the death penalty means among the ordinary folk, and I think this cuts across all ethnicity. People tend to like to view the death penalty as something that's righteous, right? They like to see that bad guy hangs or die. It's like every other movie that it's approved by a film censorship board. Bad guy must suffer, bad guy cannot come out alive. And it's the same idea when most people see the death penalty, they view it the same way. There's not really a lot of opportunity for them to see the kind of depth of where death penalty goes wrong. Like, I think Nagendran is one of those few cases where it really highlights how the system can be wrong and needs to change. So I think when we look at what MCA done, it was not so much that they part of it is they galvanized that public movement. They really went out their way to portray death penalty in a certain way, or at least the abolition of death penalty in a certain way. And it definitely round up public sentiment. But I think when we look at public itself, that underlying layer of misunderstanding or misconception is definitely there for them to exploit. So they didn't really create a view. They just found the view and just decided to run a race car with it, essentially.
Yeah, it's very interesting, Dobby, because, you know, the last time we had you on, we talked about the ways in which the state and its allies, you know, sometimes in the media also, paint a picture of those who are facing the death penalty in order to make them so monstrous that death seems the right way to go, right? And I wonder, again, with this, what is stopping those who are campaigning, like yourself, against the death penalty to make a persuasive argument? I'm sure there are a lot of very reasonable people out there who are supporters of the death penalty. And I say reasonable meaning on all other issues they would be reasonable. But on this, they have found themselves persuaded by a law and order argument. If you get rid of the death penalty, suddenly crime would shoot up, so on and so forth. Or those who are moved by emotive arguments that often centers on, say, crimes against children. Say, well, you know, we need to have, death sentence when children are involved. I mean, this kind of thinking. How do you start dealing with that?
So I think for starter, to me, most people, when they look at society, how they view society is a reflection of how they view themselves. So when someone comes to me and say, you know, if you abolish the death penalty, we are going to have mass murdering everywhere. First thing I do is I back away from the person immediately because I have a concern whether they're going to stab me immediately after that. But on the more realistic notes, when we look at it, when people say they want a death penalty, most serious crime, especially like crimes against children and things like that, it comes from, I think, a sense that something must be done. And it's always very easy to just jump to the easiest solution, because if you really want to talk about it, why does violence happen to children? The lack of oversight, parental care guidance, a whole bunch of issues, right? But none of these issues are easy. And I think we've seen this kind of conversation happen a lot, not just in Malaysia, but Taiwan is always a good example because they have had a few murder cases involving someone that has a psychotic break, essentially. And the person essentially killed a very young children, and next thing you know, everyone is calling for him to be killed. And the guy is technically a mental health patient that has a risk of violent tendency. And then when you really go down to the conversation, who's at fault? His caregiver, his doctors, the whole system that allowed him to be out roaming freely. Who's at fault? And most of this time, the public just wants an end to it, right? They want an answer that they feel that it's fair. And death penalty is just a low-hanging fruit for them to just say, yeah, that's the easy way. Kill him. He killed someone. He should deserve death. But because I think once we start going to the deeper end of the conversation of how someone commits a crime, why they committed a crime, it comes back to ourselves as a society. What have we done to prevent it? What have we done to stop it? And what do we as a society need to do moving forward? It's difficult to say those questions or to answer those questions.
Well, David, coming back to the announcement that the government made, then as an activist in this space, do you see this, the abolishment of the mandatory death sentencing, do you see this as a step towards the complete abolition of the death penalty?
Very important, because to me, when I look at it, if we look at it from this perspective, right now everyone who has a mandatory death penalty, you don't see how the defense works. You don't see how the person mitigates his case. So if someone who killed someone because he thought he had the need to protect himself, or he was caught up in the moment, or there was a psychosocial issue, they won't really see that in public sphere because it's not heard at all in court. But I think once you have the mandatory framework removed, it gives a bit of room for people to kind of look at it and say, yeah, the murderer didn't murder just because he wanted to kill someone. He did it because of protecting himself, or he did it because there was it was a fight, he lost control, someone died. And I think once people start seeing those kind of imageries that the person who is being executed or sentenced to death isn't perfect, right? It's not a perfect murderer, it's not a bad guy, it's just someone that had something happen to him and he reacted in a way. And I think once people start seeing that executions are not perfect, it's not a good guy versus bad guy situation. It's just a person caught up in a bad moment at a bad time doing something bad. Then I think that gives a lot of room for us to kind of tell the public, you see, this is what we have when we have the death penalty. There's always the exception, the exception, the exception. At which point do you even find someone who you can really sincerely say, yeah, this guy is scum of the earth, he deserves death. There's nothing good about him. And if I had to give a very bad example that people might not appreciate right now. When they look at Najib Razak, they think about corruption, right? But did they also notice during this whole announcement, his administration or his cabinet was the one that proposed abolishing the mandatory death penalty? He's not all bad. He did some good in his cabinet time in that sense. He abolished ISA. So no one's perfect, right? So where do we start? Do we want to just take a harsh line along it, or do we want to be a bit more forgiving about it?
Okay, let's talk about some of the difficulties. Let's assume that this amendment is passed and we have a situation where going forward we will not have, judges will not be tied to mandatory sentencing, but they can still sentence people to death. But because we also have a moratorium, those people are now going to be confined to death row for an indefinite period. There are multiple levels, Dobby, of potential injustice. Either people stuck in this death row limbo, or being sentenced perhaps alternative to life. I mean, when you look at these, the complications, what are the more important issues for you, do you think, in dealing with the fact that we have over 1,000 people in death row, and that's something that's going to be that needs a solution?
Well, the sad reality is most of those on death row are actually drug offenders. They are non-violent offenders for most part, and I think a good number of them are drug mules. If you look at Singapore as an example, they are very alike with us in this regards, right? How their drug trade work is also very similar. A good 90% of their people don't go on death row when they're charged for drug trafficking because they either fall under the category of the mule or someone who have assisted in enforcement agency. If you look at the same statistic and apply that to Malaysia, out of the 900-something people we have on death row, odds are only less than 10% who are actually someone who is considered a traditional trafficker, so to speak. Then when you think about it in that context, it's quite easy to reduce the number, but it really takes government to have that insight to kind of just go into these cases and say, what's the biggest chunk of people that we can deal with first? I mean, like it or not, we have to deal with it somewhere, right? Let's just address the low-hanging fruit, the easiest to identify, the easiest to clarify. If these are all drug couriers or drug mules, it's very apparent from their trial cases. Let's start with that.
Right.
Either from a resentencing or clemency or whichever it is. But I think the bigger problem to me, sorry, yeah.
Right, so no, please finish your thought. The bigger problem is?
The bigger problem is the Attorney General Chamber, I think. Because like it or not, we got here because of their lack of discretion when it comes to using the death penalty. They apply the death penalty for everything, even when there's no good evidence, especially for drug use. So right now, they are part of the equation to fix it, but I don't see how or where they're going to start, because we haven't seen any indication by the Attorney General himself to say the government has decided a policy towards abolishing the death penalty in some regards. Me as the Attorney General, what are my duties, right? Am I going to set sentencing guideline or prosecution guideline for my prosecutors? Are they going to still ask for the death penalty for everything? Or would they start having the discretion to realize, okay, some case, like say for example, Dr. Ganja, who is selling medical marijuana, he probably do not deserve the gallows. So maybe I should use my discretion not to prosecute. I still don't see that happening. I still don't hear that happening. So I'm a bit concerned about that.
Toby, where do we go, rather, because clearly my sentiments are kind of against the death penalty. Where do you as an activist and people who agree with you go now? I mean, what is going to be the argument you're going to make to the Malaysian public to persuade them to rethink, to reconsider their current position that then supports politicians who are interested in making political capital of this?
So I'll focus on two bits. One, I think, is the perception that death penalty prevents crime. I mean, we have had a moratorium of 5 years. Last I checked, the stabbing rate and murder rate has not gone up yet, unless PDRM want to correct me on that. So that deterrence argument has already failed. If it's more say about drug trafficking, when you look at Singapore, they have executed so many people, 2 this year alone. I don't see their drug trafficking going down. Actually, I think they had a record bust last year. So it's not working as a deterrent. So the other factor then people say is victims' justice. So in this case, we are talking about abolishing a mandatory death penalty, not the death penalty as a whole. If they insist or they think that this is the only form to pursue justice for the victim, honestly, at this point, I'm not going to waste my energy arguing with them. I'll just point out to them, sure, if you found the one case that you really, really think the person deserves to hang and 90% of the country agrees with you, sure, go ahead for now, right? But what about the 90% other cases where they don't fit in this category? What do you want to do with that? If you agree with us that there needs to be room for judges to be able to consider, there needs to be room for people to consider other factors, no one should be sentenced to death by default, then let's talk about it, right? This is a good way forward. It's a compromise between someone who doesn't want to see a death penalty in our system ever again and someone who thinks the death penalty is the best way forward for criminal justice. It's a good compromise, I think. So it's really up to people to hear us out and figure it out.
Debbie, thank you so much for joining us on the show tonight. Debbie Chew from the Anti-Death Penalty Asian Network. And that wraps up this episode of Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Putin, signing off for the evening.
Thank you so much for watching, and good night.
And good night.